Hey, what's up, VC? It's Steve again, Harmless Rebel. Time for another, this is kind of a what's spinning vinyl update mixed into one. A lot of this stuff is stuff I've had for years and just stuff I've been pulling out and spinning the last few days. But it's been a while since I did a video, so I wanted to throw something together real quick. So just start out with one of my all-time favorites. This doesn't get as much love as their debut, but I've always thought this album is just as good. And again, one of my all-time favorites, but this is Borrowed Time from Diamond Head. Now, it does get some criticism. Two of the songs off of here are off their debut. What was it? Am I Evil, obviously, and then Lightning to the Nations, which are actually two of my favorite songs. I also love Borrowed Time, though. I think that's such a great song, and I just don't see it get enough love. I always wondered why they took those those two tracks off their debut and threw them on here. And then I was reading one of Popov's books a while back, and he mentioned that the band had said that the Lightning for the what is it? I always get it wrong. Lightning to the Nations that was never supposed to be an album. That was basically a demo. So they kind of saw this as their first album, and that's why they took the two tracks off of there, re-recorded them for this one. I actually prefer the version of Am I Evil that's on Borrowed Time over their debut. Lightning to the Nations basically sounds the same, though, on both albums. Really a must-have, though. If you guys haven't checked this out, highly, highly recommend this. This one was 82, I think. I think it was recorded in 81. But just an absolute classic. Got a couple classics here in a row, actually. Next up, the album that got me into this band. But it's funny, I had never owned a copy of this. Back in the 80s, when I first heard this album, a buddy of mine dubbed it for me on cassette. And that's all I had for years. I just recently bought a copy of this on CD, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And just picked this up on vinyl about 3 months ago. I don't know why, I just never got around to it. It's got one of my favorite thrash songs of all time. But this is State of Euphoria from Anthrax. Like I said, this was my introduction to the band. I love this whole album, but Antisocial is one of my all-time favorite thrash songs. My band, the first band that I was in, our warm-up track was Antisocial. We would warm up with Antisocial and Surf Nicaragua from Sacred Reich, just to kind of get in the mood, you know. But still, just one of those all-time classics. And this one just doesn't get a lot of love. This was bookended by two of Anthrax's, probably their two best albums, which has a lot to do with that. And honestly, when I want to listen to Anthrax these days, I go to those two albums. But just still one that you shouldn't forget about. Just a great album. And just the song Antisocial makes it worth it. Another classic from the early era of this band. The band kind of split up and went another route after this for one album. And then came back as a power metal band. And that's what they've been ever since. Still putting out albums to this day. But these first couple albums that they released were more in the vein of Accept and just killer albums. I love these first two. But this is their second album, Witch Hunter. This is actually a recent reissue that I picked up for really cheap. It's on gold vinyl. The cool thing about this is it's the German pressing. It's a reissue of the German pressing as opposed to the English pressing or American pressing. I've always preferred this one. Their cover of School's Out is phenomenal, and that was replaced on the US version of this album, at least on LP. I'm not sure about the CD version. Love those first two Gravedigger albums, though. And another band that started off going one direction and switched it up is Halloween, Walls of Jericho. I've talked about this before. These first couple Halloween albums are my favorite when they had that more that kind of a US power metal thrash sound. Obviously with Keeper of the Seven Keys, they helped to create what would become the European power metal sound. And that's what they did the rest of their career to this day. But these first few albums are just phenomenal. And Walls of Jericho is a must-have. Kai Hansen was just at his best on this album specifically. And again, if you've only checked out Keeper of the Seven Keys, which 1 and 2 are both masterpieces and they're must-have albums. This is right up there with them. This is just as good in my opinion. This one is actually a German pressing from... it's an original German pressing. It's kind of cheap though, 8 Deutschmarks. I was actually living in Germany when this came out, and that actually seems kind of cheap for this. But regardless, Walls of Jericho. The next one I pulled out, speaking of U.S. power metal, actually, this band, if you're a fan of Metal Church, you're basically a fan of this band. Very much the same sound. The original singer from this band, was it Micro? I always get his name. Yeah, Micro. Mike Howe, sorry. Mike Howe went on to leave this band to join Metal Church. And they've always been very similar. This is their return. I think this was 2011 or 12 when this one came out. But this is A Time of Crisis from Heretic. I love this album. This may be my favorite Heretic album, and I love their debut and their EP. They're both favorites of mine, but A Time of Crisis, this is so good. And the riffs that Glenn Rogers brought to this are just phenomenal. He added a little more chunkiness and thrash to their sound than was originally there. And they've always kind of skirted that, just like with Metal Church, they've always skirted that line between U.S. power metal, not quite going into thrash, but kind of having some of those same characteristics. And Heretic is the same. This one's a little bit thrashier than what you would have gotten from their debut album, though. Still a classic. That one's still out there. That was reissued last year, I think. I say reissued, it's the first time on vinyl, but it's a must-have if you're a fan of Heretic or Metal Church. Next up, Light Force Battle Zone. So, Light Force is the band that would become Mortification. The difference is that Steve Rowe does not do the vocals on Light Force. The vocalist, I don't remember what his name is off the top of my head, was more of a 80s melodic metal. And this is kind of an 80s melodic metal. This is not the thrash or the almost death metal that you would get from later Mortification. Still really good though. I don't like this as much as the second their second album. This one is still really good though, and definitely worth checking out if you can get a hold of it. This is a 10-inch. Recommend. This was done by Soundmass in Australia. If you can get a copy of it, I would grab one while they're still available. If you're a fan of Mortification, it's just one of them that you have to have. Next up, one of probably my favorite band of the Teutonic thrash bands, of all of them, not just the big four. And their early stuff, I think, is the best of the early stuff from the big four bands. I love the first few Creator albums. But something about Sodom has always spoke to me a little bit more. And In the Sign of Evil is one of the all-time great EPs, man. This is so good. If you haven't heard this is a must-have if you're a thrash fan. I actually like this better than their follow-up LP right here. What is it? Obscured by Cruelty. I was just telling somebody yesterday, actually, Obsessed by Cruelty. I, for years and years, didn't like Obsessed by Cruelty. It didn't make sense to me that this was so good and sounded so amazing. And then Obsessed by Cruelty came out, and it was thin and hollow, and just, it didn't sound good at all. A lot of it, I thought, had to do with the guitarist. They had brought in, I can't remember his real name, but he went by Grave Violator, which is one of the worst names of all time. Right there, you got Grave Violator. He was only with the band for this one album, but I loved the guitar sound on this album. And then this one came out, and it was thin and hollow. You could barely hear the guitar, and it just sounded like crap. Well, the cool thing about this, the Wax Maniacs reissue, is disc 1 is the US version, and then disc 2 is the German version. I didn't know that this existed. So basically, they recorded the album, and the label, one of the labels, I don't know if it was SPV, didn't like the way it sounds, so they made them re-record it. And for some reason, the US version is the original recording with the really thin, really hollow guitar sound. You can barely hear the guitar on parts of the album. And then the German pressing, it sounds phenomenal. And this really made me reassess this album. Like I said, for years and years, I thought this album was so weak. It never made sense to me. But now that I've heard the German version, it's a whole different album. It's a whole different listening experience. So if you haven't heard the German pressing of this album, I highly, highly recommend picking it up. I don't know what they go for. I know these Wax Maniacs ones are crazy now. I think this is the black vinyl version. I think this one's $100 now. So the prices have gone pretty crazy. But like I said, it really made me reevaluate that album and look at it in a new way. And I actually really liked it. These next couple, Vinyl Guru did a video where she was talking about, or she was showing some Doom and some modern hard psych albums, and it got me thinking about that, and I ended up pulling out these. One of them that I had talked to her about was Scorpion Child. I think this was their second album, and so I went ahead and pulled this one out. Kind of a stoner, 70s stoner album. Really good, really dug this. This was one of my top 20 albums of the year. When was this? 13 or 14 when this came out. Killer album. And then I also pulled this one out. The Sword, Greetings from the Sword. This was a live album they did. I believe it was last year. Oh, this is 2017, so a couple years ago. The Sword's kind of a funny one. They started off as more of a Doom, like a straight up Doom album or a band, and over the years they've kind of turned more into a 70s hard rock with stoner elements. And I've liked everything that they've released. And this kind of covers quite a few of those tracks across the albums. Really good though. Next up, we got a little bit of Abattoir. Man, this album is so good and so underrated. I don't know why nobody ever talks about this album. This should be a classic. This should be an album that everybody's always talking about, but unfortunately, it never gets any love. This is one of those albums that every time I pull it out, I listen to it 5 or 6 times. Because I'll go a couple years without hearing it and forget how good it is, and I'll pop it on and just be blown away by how good it really is. Unfortunately, the band wasn't around for long, and that may have something to do with it. I believe they only had 2 albums. I don't even remember if I've heard their second album, but this one it's a must-have. It's really good. Speed, thrash, back and forth between those 2 elements of both. Absolutely phenomenal album. And again, if you're into thrash or speed metal, it's a must-have. And then last but not least, just one of the all-time great U.S. metal bands that just doesn't get a lot of love. I don't know why. Again, and these guys had 4 albums that were all absolutely phenomenal. All of their 80s albums were amazing albums, and you just don't hear much about this band, unfortunately. I know that they were a few of them were reissued the last few years. This is their 3rd, if I remember correctly, but this is the Curse from Omen. That's it, guys. I just wanted to get something out. It's been a while since I did a video. I've been kind of slacking. Work has had me crazy busy during this whole pandemic. So it's been, when I get done at my computer after 9-10 hours, I don't want to sit here and do a video. But I hope all is good. I hope everybody is doing good. Take care. Subscribe. I'll see you soon.